button. Great. John Butler, how are you feeling tonight or today? And what do you expect to get out of the call?
I'm really glad to be here. It's a long while since I reviewed Critical Path, so I'm sure I'm going to add to my knowledge, be reminded of a few things I've forgotten. And I've missed a week or two, and I'm going to miss the next 2 weeks because I'll be travelling on each of the Sundays. So just glad to be here this week, and hopefully we'll be a little wiser by the end of the call. So, Joe, how do you feel? What do you hope to take out of today?
I feel well, and it's good to be with everybody as well. It's good to see you, John, and welcome, Richard. It's good to see you as well. Yeah, I'm looking we just got started with the Critical Path, and I can already see some of its relationship to Grunch of the Giants, and I'm really excited to continue working through this book. We're moving pretty quickly, so I think that we'll have a good discussion this evening, and that's what I'm looking forward to. Manu, how do you feel? What would you like to take away from today?
Feel good. Welcome back, Richard. Well, it's always a pleasure to revisit Critical Path. No matter how many times you come back, it's going to be like a new venture, a new awakening to something. And I expect that they are going to be turned sharp ones. And that we are going to, I can't imagine how a thing, I guess, is relevant today. And I expect to kind of learn and then contribute to the best of my abilities into our understanding and our applications of those principles and the things that I discussed at large by Bucky in Critical Path. So, John, how do you feel?
No, I've gone.
You gone. It's Susan now. Or Maro, or Richard. Let me just be sure. Richard, how do you feel?
There you go.
What do you expect?
Well, I feel good. It's nice to be reconnected and connected with the memories of times that I was involved before. And today is one of our Trim Tab book club meetings. So we've been talking about Utopia and Oblivion. And we looked at Critical Path a while back. And so I, just like Manu says, it's always nice to get reconnected to the significance of Critical Path. And I know one of the things that really intrigued me years ago was Bucky's ideas about the origins of the human species and his theory about sort of the Southeast Asian kind of origins and reasons why he thought that. And so I've always been intrigued with that particular kind of thinking or theory. So I look forward to rejoining, listening, learning, and reconnecting. So over to Susan.
I feel very pleased to be with you all. I'm on emergency room call, but I'm asking the universe for time and space to be here. I anticipate that going through Critical Path again will be a different experience, and certainly informed by the other bits of study that have happened over the years. Remember meeting Kelly Ritchie for the first time and asking him for help. Was there any sort of group I could go to? Because I'd been trying for months to get through Critical Path on my own, and it just was not quite gelling for me. And it's a much different experience, Steve, to what we had heading in. I think I remember in our first group, we probably spent 4 sessions on the first little dedication page.
Cool.
So there's just so much richness there. So I'm looking forward to finding even more. Steve, how do you feel and what would you like to get out of tonight?
Okay, Joe, have you you've already spoken yours? All right, cool. Man, I must have been asleep right then. All right, great. And Edward, you have an opportunity to unmute your mic and share if you'd like how you're feeling and what you expect tonight. Going once, twice. Okay, good. We're anticipating you're an AI or some kind of an app that's helping out Edward, and I hope you got the message that you can get these calls completely off the link. So how am I feeling tonight? I feel very excited, and I'm still coming from, I think we could have spent longer on that little introduction dedication page at the beginning, but we just come out of Oblivion and or Design Discipline, Oblivia or Utopia, and we covered a lot of that there, and yet we could have gone a little bit deeper, but we'll go as deeply as we want to go. I'm still recovering from an epiphany that I had last week on a critical path. And this was something that I don't know, we talked about a little bit, but this is something where this whole concept of otherness, and I think it's just really important to capture this again. And from what I can tell, this is where if Kelly invented this thing, how are you feeling and what do you expect tonight? If he got it from this book, he got it from this section. And I don't know if that's true. Awareness of the otherness is information. And he talks about using the word feeling. How do I feel about life? What do I feel about it now? How do my feelings change? What do I feel that I need to do about what I'm feeling? I mean, this is really profound. And then he comes down here and does an E.E. Cummings, I think it was E.E. Cummings poem. On just a poet's advice. And this is all about feeling. And for me, there are kind of two things going on. And when I do a survey with somebody, it always frustrates me that they ask me what I think, but they don't ask me how strongly I feel about it. If that makes any sense to you. I mean, I can think something, but I only feel a measure of 2, but I can think something and have a measure of 10, like it's very important to me. So this was a big epiphany for me last time. And the idea of otherness and how feelings seem to be so critical to that. So I'm still pondering that and looking for that, and excited to share just based on this epiphany. Any comments or questions on what I just said about Bucky's idea of feelings or your idea about it? What do you think?
It sounds, how would I say it? If you remember tactile geometry that we did with, what's the name of a fellow again, Susan?
Fred?
The guy in China, the French guy that lives in China.
Yeah, Fred.
Fred?
With Fred, yes.
Oh my gosh, you forgot Fred. Fred should be tattooed on your brain, honey.
Yes, I'm just saying that it reminds me a lot of that experience of feeling geometry, not just intellectualizing it, but not just the intellect, but the feel. And that the two intertwine to make you have a grasp of what reality is.
Yeah. Beautiful. I remember the vector game with Fred. I mean, that was all logical, right? Except that I kept going out of the boundaries. And how I felt about that was kind of amazing. Any other comments or thoughts about feelings and otherness? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yes, I'm muted. Di and I have done a lot of programs, and one of them was Money and You, and I think it was out of Money and You. There was a process called getting people in a circle and asking the question, what do you feel like saying? And first of all, when you ask a question, and I've learned that I do a lot of speaking, and one of the things I've learned is that use questions to make sure your audience are actually listening and connected, because the brain responds to questions. And so the moment you ask a question, people's brains are going to tune in. It's possible for people to zone out if they're not being questioned, if they're just being given information. But once you put people in touch with their feelings, once you ask them questions, what do you feel like saying, or how are you feeling and what do you hope to take out of today, connects the brain and the person. So it's a a very important process to making sure people are connected and not just sitting there without being connected.
Cool. Any other?
I have another feel here.
Yeah.
If I may express it. You know, in Bucky's geometry and whatever it does, is the most fundamental general principle is that of 1 is 2, is that of duality. And he's talking about awareness of the otherness. Awareness of the otherness is not intellectual. Essential, it is emotional, and all of this. In other words, it's more of, as C would say, amplitude tuning. You know, like there is something that I feel that is different from what I think I am. It doesn't say there's something that I think. It's something that I feel. That was my point.
I think Bucky's phrase is unity is plural, minimum of 2.
Yeah,
Right.
That's it. And you can't intellectualize it, you have to live it and feel it.
Yeah. I really like, are you complete, Manu? I don't want to
Yes.
interrupt you. Good.
Yes.
I really like you brought up the amplitude part, because that was actually the epiphany that came to me, that thought is probably occurring as frequency. Somehow thought is frequency, but feelings give that thought an amplitude. You know, if I really think something is important, it has bigger amplitude than if it's just a casual thought. And I like bringing the amplitude part into the frequency modulation. I used to be a third class. I was never a first class radio operator, but we had a big thing about amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, how AM radio is based on amplitude modulation. It takes a big bandwidth. And the big breakthrough with FM radio, FM frequency modulation, instead of AM radio amplitude modulation, was that you could take the highs and lows of that frequency, which sucked up all that band rate, and you could inverse the signal so that you could push it all into fast and slow, frequent or not frequent, and get rid of the amplitude, and as a result, open up a whole bunch of bandwidth, because the width was no longer needed. And of course, that's the reason why in the US, all the media was deregulated. We used to have what we called a fairness doctrine, so that when I was program director for a radio station, if I had any opinion on my radio station, any political opinion at all, I had to give equal time to anybody who had a different opinion. So if we had 60 seconds of one point of view, anybody that called up got to get their 60 seconds in. And that was the fairness doctrine. And that really, because it was considered that the airwaves were limited and therefore they need to be regulated like a public utility. That was the principle of it. I was a member of the National Broadcasters Association. I was on several committees and got into that thing. And then suddenly when cable came out, it was decided, and FM radio came out, it was decided that, hey, bandwidth isn't that scarce anymore, so we can deregulate, because people will choose the medium that they want to choose. There's no longer going to be just 4 TV stations on the air at one time. There will be 100, so everybody can choose. Little did we know that it was going to create little information bubbles, right? And so the fairness doctrine seems to be, sorely needed in our day to day, or each individual needs to have the responsibility to say, well, that's an interesting point of view. I wonder what the other points of view are regarding this point. Let's go find them. And of course, I think that's what the beautiful thing is about this call, is we're that kind of people. We don't necessarily always agree, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. So anyway, I love
put something in the chat.
You did?
Yes. Bucky actually says, I can't remember exactly where, but he said thinking is divided and then relative.
Yeah.
So you first feel, then you think.
Well, I don't know about that. We can debate that, because I'm into neuroscience, and then the next question is, what is feeling? And so I have actually decided that astral bodies are passion bodies, and then our brain and our central nervous system picks up our mental body and our passion body. But I don't want to get into that, because it's all weirdo stuff. It's all Kabbalion and Kabbalah and a bunch of weird stuff. But that's an interesting proposition, Manu, and I take back anything I said against it. Any other thoughts or questions?
Just a quick one. One of the things that's been an extension for me around the question of how are you today, or what's your thinking, or how you feel,
Yeah.
is asking, what kind of shape are you in today? And it leaves it open, so you can talk about your physical shape, your emotional shape, your feeling shape, and it's kind of a different perspective, and it can be a little bit off-putting because nobody expects you to sort of be asking about your shape. And I'm sure that the first reaction is you're asking about my physical shape, and and even though it's in front of you, some people probably feel that it's also private. I don't want to talk about my physical shape.
Yeah.
Or what are you saying about it? Or it's almost like you take a defensive position that they're trying to criticize you. But anyway, I found it interesting in terms of asking about the shape. And
yeah, I think that I have a whole theory on that, and I'm writing a book on these 7 parts of me, 7 tools and 7 energies that I can project. But I think the key point that you're making for me, Richard, is that the words I say are significant. That if I say one thing, things tend to go in one box. If I say another thing, goes in another box. And if I say something different, it kind of opens it up. And I think that's what you're pointing out. And I think that's very wise, very wise. Good. Any other comments or questions? Okay, wonderful. Let's proceed. And we're picking up at somewhere around on page 10 of the introduction of Critical Path. And on this page, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is this yellow marked area. And John, if you don't mind, it's wonderful to hear you read. Wonderful.
Historical development of massively keeled and ribbed, deep-bellied ships, which came into human use in the 3000 to 1000 BC era of the Phoenicians, Cretans, and Mycenaeans, altogether altered and vastly enlarged the interregional and international physical transporting means of the world's lines of supply. The change was the shift over from that of the armed horsemen escorted, way-station fortress, twixt city-states, overland mule, horse and camel-borne caravanning, to the 1,000-fold greater cargo and armaments carrying capacity of the fighting crew-manned ships of those massively built wind-sailing and slave-rowed sea-going ships. Ancient Troy was a powerful city-state and commanded much of the overland traffic between Asia and Europe. The Mycenaean siege of Troy, when their supplies were continually replenished by their fleet of those heavily ribbed, deep-bellied ships, reversed the city-state's former supremacy over invaders, whose brought with them food had theretofore become exhausted long before exhaustion of the food supplies stored in the great granaries of those inside the walls. The fall of Troy saw the supremacy over human affairs pass from the masters of the overland, Asia to Europe, inland seafaring and caravanning lines of supply, to the masters of the high seas maritime lines of supply. The centre of the stage of history's most critical events moved ever westward and mildly northward. Thus, unfortified Venice became in due course the headquarters of the mast of the Mediterranean lines of supply. The 15th century Europeans' adoption of Arabic numerals and their computation facilitating positioning of numbers altogether made possible Columbus's navigational calculations and Copernicus's discovery of the operational patterning of the solar system and its planets. Facile calculations so improved both the building of the ships and their navigation that the ever larger ships of the Mediterranean ventured out into the North and South Atlantic to round Africa and reach the Orient. With Magellan's crew's completion of his planned circumnavigation, the planet Earth's predominantly water-covered sphericity was proven. The struggle for supreme mastery of human affairs thus passed out of the Mediterranean and into the world's oceans. Ships could carry vastly greater cargoes of the fabulous riches of the Orient to the European market than could the overland caravanning One European ship completing one successful round trip to the Orient could realise a great fortune for its owners. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I and a few intimates founded the East India Company. Exercising her crown privileges, the Queen granted the company limited liability for losses on the part of the enterprise backers. They could lose their money if the ship were lost, but they could not be held liable for the lives of the sailors who were drowned. While the owners could insure and very greatly limit the magnitude of their losses, the sailors and their families could not. Limited in England, Inc., incorporated in the USA, and other similar legal definitions in all capitalist countries constitute for ages uncontested, ergo, custom validated and legal judgments upheld, royal decrees greatly favouring big money capitalism over the mortal, Brentwood loss-taking vast majority of the poor.
Let's pause right there and just see if there are
Yep.
any comments or questions on what we got so far.
It's just
There are
huge.
big comments.
The
big.
magnitude of the shift in power and wealth,
How's that, John?
the magnitude of the shift in power and wealth from land to water.
Yeah.
Okay. But John, are you through that?
Yeah.
Okay. The comment that I wanted to make is this one. You see here the origin, one of manifestation of grunge. The concept of company
Hey, Jesus.
evolved from something, right? There are flows. And I'm in the world with Susan, for example. And I've accumulated, Susan hasn't accumulated, and I employ Susan. So I can take a little bit of what I have and risk it, and Susan risks all. If it goes bad, she's finished. If it goes bad, for me, it's nothing. And that is a big problem. That was my first thought on this. The second one is the whole thing that we're talking about today about China, the Belt and Road Initiative. How this thing keep repeating themselves in history, right? So you have a land exchange, but at the same time, before even you talk about the big kill stuff, there was a whole lot of traffic in the southern seas. And that's how you have a whole population in Polynesia or around the Indian Ocean, between Africa, China, and northern Australia, the coral areas. So to me, this always reducing to the most fundamental helps a lot in understanding what is the current issue that appear to be very complex and very, very, how will I call it? Let's just say complicated.
Are you complete?
Yeah.
This idea of limited liability in the design discipline, Oblivion Utopia book, Bucky there talks about the pirates. He talks about the fact that they're converting, that constantly the grunch, it was the Grunch of Giants book, that was the one, and that the grunch is constantly taking wealth and converting it into money. So they take the land that can grow food, that is wealth, that is the source of wealth, they put a loan on it, and then they have the right to take it away. And so eventually, over money, they get the wealth back. And now he's introducing this concept of corporations or limited liability companies, where, and I always thought it was nice to have limited liability. But now I see that, if I have a sailor, if I have 30 people on a crew and they die, I lose my investment. They lost their freaking life. And one of the things that Bucky says in the Grunch is that human beings create wealth. We are regenerative and create wealth. But then we're enslaved by this fiat money and by the Grunch of the Giants. So one of my big things is that, the American Revolution wasn't so much against the crown as it was against the East India Tea Company, which if the queen is part of the East India Tea Company, that's a problem. And what most people don't know, that in America, corporations were not legal. That the first corporation, that the founding fathers didn't want to have anything to do with them. And the first corporation, from my understanding, I think I got this from Tom Hartman, who's written a couple books on history, was when Ford came out with a car and they were trying to build a bridge across, I don't know, could have been I don't know which bridge it was, Brooklyn Bridge or one of those bridges and many bridges in New York. And they created a corporation that was supposed to last for 99 years as a basis to fund that bridge. And of course, they created the corporation for 99 years. It was just supposed to be created temporarily to get that bridge built. And by the time the 99 years came to be, the corporation was fixed. They changed the rules on the game, and they're still running tolls over that road. So, I don't know if they're tolls over that particular road, but that's the idea. So this idea of limited liability is profound and affects this concept of capitalism, as opposed to, and if I say capitalism versus labor, I'm suddenly very political. But if I say capitalism versus regenerative human resource, maybe that puts a little different perspective on it. Anyway, that's the thought that's coming up for me. Comments and questions?
I have another comment, which is going to seem tangential and possibly technical. They put Bucky cites Magellan as the first circumnavigation that proved the spherical nature of the world. Just checked, Magellan's journey was 1519, and there's significant reason to believe that the Chinese circumnavigated the globe in 1490s.
1492, I think.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Then they burned their boats.
Yeah.
It's even before that, there are relics, Susan.
When you say when they burned the boats, you mean the Western
Chinese.
people.
The Chinese decided, having gone out and explored the world, they would isolate themselves.
And so they burned their own boats.
Yeah, they burned their own boats.
By the time they got back to their country, there had been a change in the political system. Different people with different feelings in power.
Yeah.
Along that line of scholarship, and it's fascinating. One of the things that I'm not trying to critique Bucky's history, but it's interesting that we have perspective is just so important.
Yeah.
And if we're always looking at a European-centric narrative, we could miss the fact that people on the other side of the world beat us to a number of accomplishments.
Oh yeah. It's possible the Vikings went around the world too. And I went to Yucatan back in the 80s, and I saw a wall carving on a wall underneath the pyramid. It was, nobody went there. The guys didn't go there. I was looking for shade. So I pulled off over the side, and there was an Indian turban, an Afro haircut. And, there were multi-ethnic groups represented on that ancient carving in Yucatan. So, and the Mayan culture, of course, there's a big thing, as a Graham Hancock with his idea about Atlantis, and the idea that at 11,500 BC, there was a global epic event that caused massive flooding. And, I think that the Western, I think we've done a lot. Let me give you one more aspect, because I love what you're bringing up. I just heard a little thing on BBC tonight. They were talking about reparations for slavery. And it talked about the fact that Britain signed, the king signed an agreement to abolish slavery in 1810. It took America, it was in the 1870s, and the Africans continued to do slavery. They continued to steal their people and put them out for sale.
And so you're just going to pay reparations, the other Africans who sold them, the people in Arabia that had more slaves than the people in the US and Europe.
I was just going to bring up the Persians, and this idea of reparations for slavery gets really complicated. And from a Western point of view, we have this simplified view of the world. I'm so glad we're bringing up these different ideas. I love it.
This was just the
I really resent the word reparation for slavery. It's a deep, deep wound.
Yeah.
Really, I wanted to say that. I really resent it. So, and my view of it is we really should talk to the future. and see what are the best way to level the playing field.
Yeah.
There
That's an
can't be
enlightened point of
reparation
view.
that solves anything.
Yeah, well, that's an enlightened point of view. And right now, Manu, in America, there's a big woke movement that's all about reparation, and they don't understand the problem, and they're oversimplifying everything. If you study Evergreen State College up there, where Eric Weinstein was involved, there are some really closed-minded movements. And I really like the idea, Mandela, when he got out of prison, it's about forgiveness. It's about moving ahead. I think that's your point, right, Manu?
Yeah, and I say, let it be a lesson. Let us apply what we learn.
Yeah.
How can it be a lesson for the future?
Absolutely right.
And how can we rebalance things in the future?
Right.
That's what it is. And that's why I raised the issue that is still very relevant of today. We talk about the millennials and the way they are. You put these guys in front of a giant that is complex, and you ask them to deal with. And it comes to who has the skin, what is the level of skin in the game?
Yeah.
For the guy, for an ex-guy, it is his whole, plus his leveraging of a future, putting in that game. From the other guy is nothing. And yet, when the abuses of a system and everything comes, it is that guy, that's that little guy, that individual that bears the brunt, and it's completely demoralized, destroyed. And it's a big issue to me. How do you level the playing field of playing in our social, economic sphere?
Are you complete?
Yeah.
Say when you're complete, because sometimes you pause poetically and it's easy to interrupt. So please announce when you're complete. Any other comments or questions? Richard, I see you kind of itching your hand. Unmute your mic and go for it.
Well, one of the things that intrigued me about this section of the book, and it reminded me when you read the excerpt there, is the reference to the East India Company being formed in the 1600s. And it speaks to the Eurocentricism that a lot of us are familiar with and aware of. But it always intrigued me as to why was India referred to as East India? And from England, if you want, you had to travel east and south to get there. But when I spent some time, 6 months or so, in India in the 90s, the Indian people referred to themselves in many cases as East Indians. And I would often ask, why are you doing that? I mean, I would think you would be the ones who could claim to be Indians. And it's going back to this, words matter, and it gets embedded in our language and our understanding. And instead of trying to correct that in some way, we continue to perpetuate the center of the earth, if you want, or universe or globe is in the empire. And yet that East India word just always triggers me in terms of thinking about why do people who are the Indians allow themselves to be identified as the East Indians?
Yeah, you bring up because the British would refer to the West Indies.
Yes.
And that's before we had, in our country, we have American Indians. And I'm not sure, is the word Indian even, is that offensive in some way? I don't know. I'm pretty sure I go around offending people all the time. And I'm just old enough now that I can tell them, hey, look, I'm a dinosaur. I don't have as many pronouns as you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? I want to share something. Because John brought up the fact that, and Susan started with the idea that Chinese had circumnavigated the globe in 1492, and then
It was actually earlier than that.
It was actually earlier than that, huh? Thank you for pointing.
I've just been doing a little bit of research. In 1433, the government made it illegal to explore overseas by sea.
Wow.
It was not only discouraged, it was made illegal.
It was made illegal. Wow, I'm so glad I brought it up. I'm so glad you brought that in. That is profound. Do you guys know in Chinese, in Chinese kanji, do you know what the symbol for China is? This blew me away because I've studied Chinese. I've studied it for a couple of years. One day I would like to be able to speak the language with any kind of fluency. But that is the symbol for China right there. A rectangle with a axis, on axis. That is the Chinese symbol for China right there. I just thought, it's the center of the universe. If you ask a Chinese person what that symbol means, they'll say it's the center of the universe. So that brings up, just so much stuff. How very cool.
So Chinese navigators were using the float compass by 1050. In 1070, the Chinese developed dry docks. In the 1100s, Chinese junks reached the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. In the 13th century, Chinese ships regularly ventured to India and occasionally to East Africa.
Wow. Beautiful information.
For China, it's interesting to know that geographically, China is bordered by the Himalayas and by the Great Western Desert. And you have great rivers that flow from those mountains to the southeast of China. And migration of Homos came south into China to populate. And those barriers created a natural kind of environment where you have some homogeneity. So given the numbers, China has always been massive in comparison to the remainder of humans, of other nations for a long time. So it gives the impression that, hey, there you are. Even today, when you look at China, the expression of their international politics, it is not to go, they want to trade. But they are very, very firmly on China as land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you complete?
Yep.
Okay. I'd love, Joe, I don't want to put you on the spot. Joe has made a study of the of the Tao Te Ching, and he's made a huge study on Confucianism, which was 600 BC. I think about 600 BC, right, Joe? I'd love for you to comment on how maybe Confucianism affected this isolation idea. Is there any way you can come to that in a minute? Can you speak to isolationism from a Confucius point of view? Or whatever's coming up for you, my friend. You've been studying it for quite a while.
It's hard for me to make the jump to isolationism, but there's a hierarchical structure that is in place, and that essentially looks at, I guess it would be isolationist in a way, that the idea of country would be coming first, and it would be a very nationalistic perspective. It'd be also a very higher, like kind of respecting the offices that exist in the government itself. So that would be very much in line with the idea that you're not going to necessarily need to deal with outsiders. So be more tribal, so to speak. That would be the first initial thoughts that I would have.
Cool.
But yeah, there's a heavy dose of as far as respect for authority and offices that would lend itself to nationalism.
Good. As you think of things that come up, maybe at the end you can bring some things up, or whenever you're inspired.
Cool.
Because more and more may come to you about that. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
Joe pronounced the word respect
Hmm.
of the order, prevailing order.
Yes.
Does that not come with bureaucracy?
Yes.
And is bureaucracy not the consequence of being a large group in a certain place, and there are interests that are established, and there's need for intermediaries to trade and tax and do all of those things?
Yes. I mean, yes,
But how do you put that then?
with nationalism.
No, with the fact that Chinese artifacts has been found in so many places in the world, far remote from China.
I can tell you why, though, Manu.
Yes.
In 75 years before Columbus set sail for the West Indies, Zheng He, who was the most famous Chinese sailor, sailed his massive fleet of more than 200 six-masted Chinese ships manned by 28,000 seamen to ports in Southeast Asia, India, Ceylon, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and East Africa. He was a goodwill ambassador, although his army was formidable and he didn't shrink from engaging in military force when confronted by hostile local rulers. His fleet of treasure ships went abroad not as conquerors, but as cultural goodwill ambassadors. Wherever he went, Zheng He liberally dispensed gifts of Chinese silk and porcelain, accepting in return valuable native products from his hosts, including a variety of exotic African animals destined for the Imperial Zoo in Beijing, where their latter-day descendants still reside. He also brought with him back to China as guests of the Imperial Court emissaries from at least 30 princely states from around the world. He was undoubtedly the most successful maritime explorer and goodwill ambassador in Chinese history. But his pioneering journeys ended not in glory, but disgrace. Following the death in 1424 of his patron, the emperor, a cabal of conservative court officials decreed an end to Chinese maritime exploration. Fearing Zheng's growing fame and political influence, they burned all of his charts and shipbuilding blueprints. They allowed his decommissioned treasure ships to rot in the harbour, and he himself died on his final voyage in 1433 and was buried at sea. So 1433, they said, no, don't need more contact with the outside world. But it was because his patron, the emperor, died and the forces in the imperial court wanted to stamp out his influence and power.
What was his name?
Zheng He. Zheng He.
Cool.
John, can you put it in the chat if you're not busy?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Please.
Wow. And it's good that you continue to read, John. Very, very enlightening. Very, very good. Any other comments? Go ahead, Susan.
I believe it was a National Geographic special. So there actually have been documentaries that follow this up and look at some of the archaeologic evidence left behind. And so they're, instead of just reading, but I remember reading those books many years ago and enjoying them tremendously. Columbus had on his voyage somebody who'd been on with the Chinese fleet.
Oh,
That was his ace in the hole advantage.
wow.
But you look at, so the other thing that comes up when I hear that, and it was just an unbelievable idea that a government would try to erase knowledge. They went in and they burned the charts and the records, and they tried to take something that should have been a treasure, not just to the people of China, but could have been a treasure to the people of the world. And grunge, that iteration of grunge tried to control it and not let it organically come and be regenerative.
Wow. Any other comments or questions? Wow.
And that just makes me feel like what we just went through around COVID. So I feel like scientific discussion was stymied with censorship. And I don't mean to be political about it. You know, I'm not necessarily right. I would just say that discussion was not allowed.
Yeah. You know, I was shocked to find out, as I've been studying imaginary numbers and the history of imaginary numbers, that in around the 1700s, there was a guy who discovered and created the formula for imaginary numbers, and he would not release it because it meant his job. If he put out the formulas and other people could then surpass him, he would lose his job as the head mathematician in Venice, or I don't know where he was, in some city. And so finally, another mathematician really wanted to know what was going on there. So they had a conversation, and the guy who knew it had the other guy make a blood oath that he would not reveal the secret to anyone, even after he was dead. And the guy took the blood oath, but it bothered him. And he kept studying, and then found a nephew or somebody of the guy who died. And in writings from that guy to the nephew, he found the code. And thus imaginary numbers were revealed. So it's amazing how economic forces have been grunching on the people for hundreds of years and possibly thousands of years. Any other comments or questions? Okay, cool. John, as if you haven't done enough reading.
Happy to do it.
Let's continue. Thank you.
Okay. So
Where are we?
I think we're a little bit above this, weren't we? Above
Yeah, we
this?
Yes, we were. Had you read was
I don't think we'd read that.
okay, let's start there anyway.
Okay.
If you
Elizabeth.
suddenly realize that you read it already, just skip to the next one. I'll catch up with you. Okay, go ahead.
No, I don't think I've read that.
All right.
Elizabeth's East India Company scheme was to have her national navy and armies first win mastery of the world's sea lanes. This advantage would thereafter be exploited by her privately owned enterprise. This scheme became one of the first of such national power structure bids for establishing and maintaining world trade supremacy through dominance of the world's high seas, ocean currents, trade winds, critical straits, and only seasonably favourable passages world around line of vital and desirable supplies. All the other world power stature individuals who vied for supreme mastery of the world's high seas lines of supply also operated invisibly through monarchs and nations over whom they had sufficient influence. Through such behind the throne influence, the influenced nations' resources could be politically manoeuvred into paying for the building and operation of the navies and armies that would seek to establish and protect their respective privately owned enterprises. With the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the British Empire won the world's power structures championship and became historically the first empire, upon which it was said the sun never sets. This is because it was the first empire in history to embrace the entire spherical planet Earth's 71% maritime, 29% landed, wealth-producing activities. All previous empires, Genghis Khan's, Alexander the Great's, the Romans, et al., were unified European, North African, and Asian-controlled river, lake, and sea embracing flat-out land areas completely surrounded in all lateral directions by the infinitely unknown. All earlier empires were infinite systems, open systems. The British Empire was history's first spherically closed finite system. Building and maintaining the world's most powerful navy, the 1805 supremely victorious British Empire was to maintain its sovereignty over the world's oceans and seas for 113 years. Concurrently with its 1600 AD initiated 2 centuries of maritime and military struggle for world dominance, England was also developing a civilian army of the world's best informed and empire-backed scientific, economic, and managerial personnel for the most economically profitable realisation of its grand world-embracing strategies. To educate the army of civil servants was the responsibility of the East India Company College, located just outside of London. In 1980, it is as yet operating. Its graduates went to all known parts of the planet to gather all possible data on the physical and human culture resources to be exploited, as well as information on the local customs of all the countries, large and small, with whom Great Britain and the East India Company must successfully cope and trade. In 1800, Thomas Malthus, later professor of political economics of the East India Company College, was the first human in history to receive a comprehensively complete inventory of the world's vital and economic statistics. The accuracy of the pre-Trafalgar 1800 inventory was verified by a similar world inventory taken by the East India Company in 1810. In a later post-Trafalgar book, Malthus confirmed in 1810 his 1800 finding that the world around humanity was increasing its numbers at a geometrical progression rate while increasing its life support production at only an arithmetical progression rate. Ergo, an increasing majority of humans would have to live out their short years in want and misery. Pray all you want, said Malthus, it will do you no good. There is no more. How wrong. A half century later, Darwin expounded his theory of evolution, assuming that nature's inexorable processes were the consequences of the survival only of the fittest species and individuals within those species. Karl Marx
Let's pause right there for a second. Any comments on anything there?
I found this on the web.
What?
That was
No.
I think that was a
Yeah,
Siri or something.
Google or Alexa or somebody.
Yeah.
with Siri.
I mean, this is interesting to see him come to Malthus and to talk about Malthus, because obviously that was one of his main reasons for coming up with the idea, if other people had thought of it in different ways, but of ephemeralization.
Well, no, I think he didn't embrace ephemeralization. What he did was he assumed that those then who knew anything knew everything, and that there were limits to the ability to produce, not allowing for any advances, breakthroughs.
Yeah, I meant Bucky embraced ephemeralization, whereas Malthus is looking at things very linearly, in the sense that
And saying people are out of luck.
Yeah, and honestly, more than anything, it's one-dimensional thinking. Is that you kind of see what the perils of that are when you just say this is the way the world is and this is the way it's going to be, and not necessarily think about things that are unseen or haven't been invented yet, or brought into existence yet. And I think that that's where, Bucky was actually thinking about things in technological terms, and how technology makes progress, not just looking at what's in front of him right now, and that's the way it's going to be. He saw things that were possible.
Right.
And you also see the pathway from Malthus to Darwin to Spencer, and the belief that the social fit to live comes into play. And if you go back into the 1600s, coming out of England too, you then see the emergence of the English Poor Laws, which in a sense reinforce the Malthusian theory that there's not enough to go around, so it's a survival of the fittest. And we end up with the division of the privileged few and the marginalized many, and the hierarchy of social structure starts to become more and more apparent and organized.
Well said. I want to defend Darwin. I wish now I had kept track of what's going on, but there are a lot of people now who are saying that Darwin was victimized by a Copenhagen interpretation type focus on what he wrote, that he was not. His main premise was not survival of the fittest. And he may have said that. I mean, Bucky's quoting him here, but that was not the main premise of his book. And I wish now, I just in the last couple of weeks have been listening about Darwin and how enlightened he was. But the environment, the intellectuals interpreted a certain way, put him in a box and used him as an excuse to promote their agenda. And if I look at, I think if we study what Darwin actually said, he had some enlightened stuff in there too. And I think this idea of survival only of the fittest species, I'm going to look this up. I'm going to see if I can go back to some of my stuff I've been studying and see if I can pull that out. So I just want to defend Darwin there because I think he's become a tool of the grunge.
Yeah, I
Love it.
think, and you go into the work of Lynn Margulies and what she did with in Symbiosis, you begin to see that there could easily be a word missing in the survival of the fittest, in the sense it's the survival of the collaborative or cooperative fittest, those who can live and work together and assist each other.
Right.
Okay. Are you through, Richard?
Yes, complete.
Okay, if I might come in here, to me, there were two very important things that he said. He said infinitely unknown and finite known. Did you see that?
Yeah, it was
Infinitely unknown and finite known. And the second thing that I will make a comment on is definitely that survival of the fittest, actual fact, goes for universe. Universe is efficient, always does in the most efficient ways. I'm not saying you being fittest or any individual species, but the reality is that if you are not the fittest, you're not going to survive in the bigger scale of things, because universe can dispense of you. Not the universe, nature can dispense of you. And the third thing that I say, that I think I want to make comment on is, in actual fact, that we're talking about linearity, but most phenomena and processes in nature occur by action of gravity as opposed to radiation. What I mean is that accumulation of things. They accumulate. And the first phase of accumulation is pretty linear. It's not, you don't feel it. It's like you adding 1 to 1 is 2. But it reaches, all processes reaches what you call critical stage of mass and then become exponential. So yes, Malthus could have, in light of what he received as information, thought linearly and say, because he could observe the geometric multiplication of the population, as opposed to his awareness of what the resources were, come to the conclusion that there's inadequacy between those resources and the rate of population of this planet. That was my comment.
Thank you. Any other comments on that? I want to point out what Manu's saying is absolutely correct, but I think the mistake comes, and I'm gonna hope that I've got the right handout here, because I've been studying this idea of compounding and the idea of how things look so linear. I hope this is the right one. At the beginning, it's hard to tell that you have an exponential relationship. If you take a penny and compound it, you know, you get 1 penny the first day, second penny, 2 pennies the next day, 4 pennies the next day. It's very minimal. But as you start looking at what goes on, as Manu said, it starts out real slow and then all of a sudden, whoosh, it goes up in a major fashion. And it catches people by unawares. Another important thing to look at, I think, is what's called the Pareto principle. The Pareto principle is an idea, and Jordan Peterson's big on this. The Pareto principle is the idea that in its simplest form, it simply says it's the 80-20 rule. Mm-hmm. That 20% of whatever produces 80% of the results you create. But then there's another aspect of that Pareto principle mathematically that'll actually prove to you and show you how that when you're growing a garden, the stuff in the middle of the garden gets bigger and is more productive than the stuff on the edges of the garden. And that's the way it always is. And so Jordan Peterson argues that when somebody talks about redistribution, like in the Chinese Revolution, where they kicked out, and the Chinese have done this evidently several times based on this 1433 dictum that made international travel illegal. You know, when Mao Zedong came in on the revolution, man, anything Western, they got rid of it. They put people in jail, they killed them. It was like this big stomp out. And because people don't understand nature, and the Pareto principle is part of that, and it works right with compounding. It was so interesting because I saw a chart one day of the COVID virus, and it was going, here's the way it goes, and all of a sudden, and I looked at it and I said, that's a compounding chart. That's a financial compounding chart. And I whipped it out, and that was a big theme for me for like 6 months, was that, you know, don't be alarmed. That's exactly what life is about. So get out, hurry up and compound, just like COVID. I'm sure that was politically incorrect, but there you go. Any other comments or questions? Okay, cool. Let's continue. I put an X on there, John, so I would not forget where we were. Here we are, right
and
here.
I've sent through the 7 factors that are reputed to have contributed to China's success.
Well, let's hear those.
They're in chat.
Oh, they are in chat? Do you want to review them?
Yeah, sure, I'll read them out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Factors contributing to China's power and insularity. 1, mastery of wet rice cultivation. 2, perfection of large-scale water management techniques. 3, creation of an efficient civil service with recruitment by competitive examination. 4, adoption of a patriarchal value system that emphasised obedience of wives to husbands, sons to fathers, and subjects to the emperor. 6, or whatever, 5 or 6, a well-developed legal code that deterred deviant behaviour by swift and severe punishment. Development of advanced metallurgical techniques that sustained armaments, and finally, being ringed on 3 sides by smaller, weaker states willing to pay tribute to the Chinese emperor. All those sustained China for centuries. And from 1433 for the next 400 years, China was effectively insulated, unaware of the developments taking place in the rest of the world, particularly Europe. So by the time they had contact with the West again, it was a very different world.
Yeah.
The Chinese had not changed at all in 400 years. The rest of the world had developed.
And I think, wasn't it in the 1800s or pretty close to there when that the Opium Wars occurred, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was the
British sent their ships and their soldiers in,
Yeah.
and defeated the Chinese.
Yeah.
And then imposed on them, and the Chinese never got over that. They still haven't got over it. But
And if I understand it right, the Opium Wars, so the Western civilization could keep opium flowing into the Western civilization, which is what? Absolutely.
they also stole tea. They stole tea from China and transported it to India, where they cultivated it. Because prior to that, tea wasn't outside of China. It was only in China.
Wow.
We didn't know that.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think it's more, it might not be as simple as that. Yes, there are features that support that explanation, but there are many other things within. And comes to the values. What are the prevailing values in the society? Right? And it comes to, and even further, you can go to start looking at the existence of organized versus loose. And that's quite interesting, John, to put it in contrast with a book that you suggested here, The Sovereign Man.
Oh,
The sovereign individual. It's very, very interesting to contrast those two. And I think both are necessary because you always have the interplay. If you have a system, you have to have processes in a system. And that's what Chinese were to develop. It's not isolation, it was that. There you have a society that's much more fluid, that's much more, not fluid, much more extended, right? Much more radiative that comes. How do the two interact? And we are bound to commit the same mistakes if we don't learn from that. It is a whole, it is a system. You are in one phase, today, people are decrying in societies that we have too much regulation. That is a kind imprisonment, isn't it? People want more say, more determination, more participation. But it only comes because we are aware that, you know, hey, what was good yesterday was that phase might not be that good today. So in terms of China and the Opium Wars and all these things, as humanity, we all commit the same sins and the sins of ignorance, or not knowing the limit of things, and that they are valid for a while. And then we are born, if we want to progress, is to learn from those and take those values that work forward and apply them in the new circumstances to try to be the best that we can in progressing.
But the crazy thing is, Manu, that despite the increased ability to communicate with one another, particularly using the internet and social media and information being so much more available, there is so much more information available through the internet than there ever was. And yet it seems to me that increasingly the majority of people in the world are being controlled by the giants.
Yeah.
That Bucky's grunch of giants is in fact stronger than ever. I met a friend this last week who showed me a book that he was reading called Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths, 2021 and 2022, put together by Edward Dowd, but there's a foreword by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And so just there are stats, it's full of facts, stats, graphs, and reference to other articles. So I'm about to start reading that. But what it did reinforce for me was the influence of the giants that Bucky was writing about 40 years earlier. If anything, it's stronger, not weaker.
Yeah.
But let's just take it, John, into, sorry, just take, in the context of today, and let's look about the last 50 years or 40 years. Bernanke wrote a book or an essay to say, depression, let's make sure that it doesn't happen here. I think that paper you quoted in Tokyo sometime. Now comes 2005, 6, 7. Then we apply, you know, monetization of debt. We issue money and it seemed to work. But we forget quickly that it just worked for a while. And that condition are changing.
Right.
And then we continue applying the same stuff. We say, this is drug, that's nice, it's working. And become immune to its effect. And what is happening today is that if you start to squeeze a little bit the supply of money, there's depression. We are between the hammer, the rock, and hard place.
Right.
What do you do?
But is that because governments have mismanaged money and have allowed big business to effectively control and direct governments? I mean, if you look at the world's energy systems, energy was something that Bucky wrote a lot about. It stressed the importance of it. The availability of electricity was the single most important factor to standard of living, infant mortality, a whole lot of other things. And yet now, in recent times, the cost of electricity, for example, in Britain has quadrupled. I've had people say my bill was £200 a month, now it's £800 a month, and there are intermittent blackouts. So A, it's becoming unaffordable, and B, it's unavailable. So that's something we've known was critically important all along, but governments haven't invested appropriately. They haven't managed it appropriately. They've allowed it to be manipulated. What was the name of the American company that was trading in electricity? That
Enron.
Enron?
Enron.
Yes, Enron. Okay. So, but it doesn't seem to have improved much. we appear to have the same sorts of things. We've got huge debate in Australia about our gas and whether we should sell it overseas, our electricity, how it's generated. We've got the fight between coal and oil and renewables. So governments play a part in all that, but whatever part they've played doesn't seem to have been successful. And so I'm increasingly disillusioned with and distrustful of governments. But I think Bucky was there 40 years ago anyway.
But John, you say government, but we are all, a government, whether if it's the what you call democratically government, democratic government, it has been elected by people, right? Who believe in what they say.
Were those people exercising their rights, relying on facts or lies?
Yeah, if he's a dictator, he has followers. The reality is that we are resigning our right to be educated, and to exercise that knowledge individually. That's the reality. It's so difficult to find committed people to really to even participate in their lives. Commit to participate in their lives. It's difficult. And we're quick to say government. Government did it. We went, when there was easy credit, we rushed to it. Bitcoin mania, we went to it. We believe in it. Why do we believe in it? It's not the government that made you believe in it. We decided to believe in it.
I think both governments and the giants have a significant input in education.
I believe that's why Bucky said is the individual who is in final examination. But when you look at it as a system, for a system to work, all the parts of a system have to work, and we're part of a system individually.
Perhaps that's why the system isn't working.
Yes. So it has to be tossed out. Who tosses out?
It is amazing right now because I try not to watch news pretty actively, but I've seen, just being in the hospital, some pictures of France and Israel, and seeing people who are representing their thoughts and beliefs literally, and they seem like, it's not they're not far radical people coming out and saying, no, government, these are policies I don't agree with. And it's been interesting to watch. It seems like Macron's going to get away with it for now. I don't know that he ever gets elected. I don't know if he ever cares to be elected again. But boy, is this, what's going on in Israel looks like a powder keg. That seems to be much more fundamental.
But if the extremists, if Netanyahu and his supporters achieve what they want, which is basically to destroy the protection provided by an independent legal system, so they control everything, they're only more likely to provoke armed conflict in the Middle East.
I know.
They are extremists, they're anti-Palestinians, their policies, to somebody who doesn't know much about it, seem to be designed to provoke armed conflict. And I think that's why otherwise many Israelis who wouldn't otherwise have done so can see the danger and are out protesting.
Yeah. I've heard one Israel pundit, some guy in the country that was in something, said that Netanyahu was trying to maintain his power in order to not go into court over all these problems, and that he hooked up with some very conservative people in order to get the power, and it may be slipping out of his hands, that this conservative thing is taking over. They're trying to wipe out the power of the court so they won't have the three branches, because evidently the Israeli there is no Supreme Court in the Israeli Constitution. Like in America, we have the three branches of government. They only have two, and the court has been functioning modeled on the US but there's no constitutional law to give it any power. And so they can strip it with just simple legislation.
Hmm.
Yeah. Interesting, because that same crap is going on in America with certain segments on the right, and there seems to be no letting up on it. And I've talked to those people. I know I have an attorney friend who plays guitar. You'd think he's a hippie, you'd think, but he's absolutely convinced that the election was fraudulent and will not let go of it, even though 62 cases were brought up in federal courts, and
Yep.
none of those showed any. They were all dismissed.
Irregularity, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Hey, good. Any other comments or questions? I threw some stuff in there on the Pareto principle. If you look at the chat, you'll see the graphs of Pareto. They look just like compounding graphs that Manu was talking about. The universe, between Fibonacci sequence and between Mandelbrot set functions and between imaginary numbers, the universe does not work arithmetically at all. It's more complicated than that. Cool. Okay, let's see here. I hope I put an X by where we were reading, John. I did. I did. There it is.
Okay.
Okay. Now,
Mark.
I
Yes.
want to just say, I'm sorry. He's going to bring Darwin into this again, and I want everybody to have a moment of silence for Darwin as we read this. Go ahead, John.
Karl Marx compounded Malthus's and Darwin's scientifically convincing conclusions and said, in effect, the worker is obviously the fittest to survive. He is the one who knows how to handle the tools and seeds to produce the life support. The opulent others are parasites. The opulent others said, we are opulent and on top of the heap because we demonstrate Darwin's fittest to survive. The workers are dull and visionless. What is needed in this world is big thinking, enterprise, courage, cunning, and fighting skill. For the last century, these two ideologies, communism and free enterprise, have dominated the political affairs of world around humanity. Each side says, you may not like our system, but we are convinced that we have the fittest, fairest, most ingenious way of coping with the lethal inadequacy of life support operative on our planet. But because there are those who disagree diametrically on how to cope, only all-out war can resolve which system is fittest to survive. Those in supreme power politically and economically, as of 1980, are as yet convinced that our planet Earth is has nowhere nearly enough life support for all humanity. All books on economics have only one basic tenet, the fundamental scarcity of life support. The supreme political and economic powers as yet assume that it has to be either you or me, not enough for both. That is why, one, those in financial advantage fortify themselves even further, reasoning that unselfishness is suicidal. That is why, two, the annual military expenditures by the USSR representing socialism and the USA representing private enterprise have averaged over 200 billion a year for the last 30 years, doubling it last year to 400 billion, making a thus far total of $6 trillion, $400 billion spent in developing the ability to kill ever more people at ever greater distances in ever shorter time. Weighing only 55 pounds with a wingspan of 96 feet, the human-powered gossamer albatross was able to fly across the English Channel because the structural materials of which it was built were many times tensilely stronger than an equal weight of the highest strength aircraft aluminium. The tensile strengths of the albatross's structural materials were 60 times stronger per equivalent weight than the strongest structural materials available to Leonardo da Vinci for realizing the design of his proposed human-powered flying machine. The albatross's high-strength carbon fibre and mylar materials were all developed only a short time ago, since World War II.
Let's pause
Hey,
right
what-
there, if
Yeah.
we're okay to do so. Any comments on anything so far? I had something that sparked up there, and I got
I had something as well. If you keep going up, I just
keep going up.
The idea of scarcity.
Yeah.
That's actually important because it's still taught. And I think that it is a conventional way of thinking about things in terms of economics. And only, again, we only look at it through a monetarist lens. And I think that that's actually leads to the financialization of all the transactions, which actually kind of leads us to where we are, as affordability goes.
Yeah, I like the idea that unselfishness is suicidal. That's kind of an interesting twist.
Hmm.
Okay. And we talked about the albatross going across.
Yeah, we're up to a 1/4 ton communication satellite is now outperforming the previously used 175,000 tons of transatlantic copper cables, with its 700,000-fold reduction in system equipment weight, providing greater message carrying capacity and transmission fidelity, as well as using vastly fewer kilowatts of operational energy. Continuing to attempt to fit our late 20th century astronautical man on moon visiting capability into a 19th century horse and buggy street pattern, house to house yoo-hooing lifestyle, and a land baron racket is so inefficient that the overall design of humanity's present social, economic and political structuring and the physical technology it uses wastes 95 out of every 100 units of the energy it consumes. Yep. Our automobiles' reciprocating engines are only 15% efficient, whereas turbines are 30%, jet engines 60%, and fuel cells used by astronauts 80%. In the United States, throughout all 24 hours of every day of the year, year after year, we have an average of 2 million automobiles standing in front of red stoplights with their engines going, the energy for which amounts to that generated by the full efforts of 200 million horses being completely wasted as they jump up and down going nowhere. Environment controlling buildings gain or lose their energy as heat or cool only through their containing surfaces. Spheres contain the most volume with the least surface, i.e. have the least possible surface to volume ratio. Every time we double the diameter of a spherical structure, we increase its contained atmosphere 8-fold and its enclosing surface only 4-fold. When doubling the diagram of our sphere, we are not changing the size of the contained molecules of atmosphere. Therefore, every time we double a spherical structure's diameter, we halve the amount of enclosing surface through which an interior molecule of atmosphere can gain or lose energy as heat or cool. Flat slabs have a high surface to volume ratio, and so flat slab fins make good air cooling motorcycle and light airplane engines. Tubes have the highest surface to volume ratios. Triangular or square section tubes have higher surface to volume ratios than have round section tubes. Tall slab buildings and vertical square section tubular tower skyscrapers have the maximum possible energy as heat or cool losing capability. One 2-mile diameter dome enclosing all the mid-Manhattan buildings between 22nd and 62nd Streets and between the Hudson and East Rivers, having a surface that is only 1/84th that of all the buildings now standing in the Midtown area, would reduce the heating and cooling energy requirements of that area 84-fold.
Wow. Wow, let's pause right there. He got into a bunch of geometry here and got into his tetrahedral thing in a major way. I wish we had time really to look at all that math, but I'm not smart enough to do that.
But in a nutshell, he's saying that we are continuing to do things in the way that is least efficient. We're burning up resources unnecessarily. We're not operating efficiently. We could drastically reduce our energy use and dramatically increase what was available using less materials if we would just stop doing things in the same inefficient ways we've always done them.
Right on. Any other comments or questions on that? Richard,
not so much on that right now, just to go back to the Marx and the communism and capitalism issue or free enterprise issue. Both of them have underbellies that are problematic. So the the communist sort of underbelly is the individual, and the individual is denigrated, disregarded, etc. The capitalism underbelly is the collective, and you don't pay attention to the collective. It's all about rugged individualism. It's all about self-determination. And so the marginalized are forgotten or discarded or denigrated. So that's, Bucky was saying that years ago, that both of them have underbellies that aren't being paid attention to in a decent kind of way. And so both of them are, in his opinion, wrong or ineffective or inefficient or not addressing the 100% of humanity. They're still addressing the privileged few. They just define them differently.
You also,
Just Richard, what is the issue?
What is the issue?
Yes. I want you
Yeah.
to conclude on your thought. What is?
Well, the issue is, if it's going back to unity as plural, if either one of those two systems are going to operate effectively and efficiently, they have to decently deal with the underbelly, or they have to make sure that the underbelly doesn't exist in the traditional way, and you do what Fuller says, that you uplift the underbelly into something that allows them to be, if you want, millionaires along with everybody else, that there is enough to go around. And so both of those systems still ignore the notion of unity as plural minimum two. And they still operate pretty much on the theory of the survival of the fittest. The Malthusian theory is not ancient; it's contemporary.
yeah.
So the issue is still education. What I'm hearing you say, is it?
Well, the issue is going back to the factors of what brought China to a power. Is the value system. Education can be a delivery mechanism, but if the value system, using the China as an example, stays with patriarchy and subjugation, then the educational system will cater to that. So yeah, I don't think education comes first. I think or maybe it's education about value systems that comes first, that'll bring about the transformation. That's sort of the chicken and the egg kind of issues that we continue to struggle with.
Can I say something there? I think according to Bucky, the value system is clear. It's
Yeah, his value system is
only generalized principles. Those are his values.
That's right.
So it's only generalized principle. So to me, what is left is, how do we discover those principles and how do we harness and apply them? So it has everything to do with education. What are we giving and receiving as education? And what are we applying? Because we don't invent those principles. We just have to discover them. They are there already.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They are there.
Are you complete?
Yes, I'm complete.
Richard, you put in there something about a tetrahedral. You tried to apply the tetrahedral model to something. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I clicked the send sooner than I was ready to, but yeah, what I was doing is say, keep trying it out anyway. with my minimum whole system mapping using the tetrahedral concept. And my 4 factors are validators. It starts out with the self, however that's defined. It's a self, and then 3 kinds of otherness: validator otherness, personal otherness, and resource otherness. So I was just roughly trying to put those factors in there. So the validator others, if I overlaid them in China back then, would be the patriarchal system, the legal code that forces you into compliance. And then you have, in the people side, you have the husbands and the fathers and the emperors who are have the authority or in charge, and then they relate to those who are subjugated to them, the sons and the wives and the subjects. And then the resource others have to do with what was being described as the wet rice work that was done, the large scale water management, the civil service efficiency, and the advanced metallurgical techniques. And you put them all on the resource side, and it creates this little basic whole system tetrahedral map. And then you can see how the relationships play out between those, or the 6 relationships that play out between those 4 basic areas and their subsets that make up what John had described as how China got to be, number 1, powerful, and number 2, to take on this insular sort of attitude about its existence in relationship to others. You know, it's fun to play with it.
What's the self? How are you defining the self again?
Well,
Sure.
self has got a number of layers, so it could be the individual, but using what John had described, I was using self to mean the fathers,
Right.
and the husbands and the emperor.
Okay.
And then the subjugated others are the wives and the sons and the subjects.
Okay, you see how the others, the self, the validators, and then the resources. Are
Yeah.
those, and what are those 4 things called? What do you have a name?
Well-
Is there a generalized name for those 4 elements?
Oh, well, it's the
Tetrahedron.
it's a minimum whole system tetrahedral
The tetrahedron.
mapping. Yeah,
It's a node. It's a node, or it's a vertices in the.
that's right. Yes.
There's your 4 vertices, your 4 crisscrossings of these energies. And what blows me away about the tetrahedron is that all of the nodes have the same relationship with each other. In other words, every node has a relationship with every other node. That's why that 4 factor is so freaking critical. Because if I put 5 in there, it's going to relate, it's not going to have an equal distribution of energy. That's why I think that tetrahedron is so profound.
Yeah. Well, you
And-
also
That's
see
just a
the
minimum idea system, Steve.
What's
It's a-
that?
It's a minimum idea system.
Yeah, minimum.
It's a
idea-
minimum system, idea system, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, minimum idea system, geometry of thought kind of thing. Is that
Yeah.
what you're
and
saying?
what I did was I took the 7 and I distributed it around the 4.
The 7
And
what? 7 what?
the 7 factors that John spoke
Oh,
about.
I see. You just took
And I put them into the system.
Yeah.
Then what happens is that if you only have 4 vertices, you get 6 relationships, as you just described.
Right.
And when you do the math on that, 6 is 50% more than 4.
Yeah.
If you go to 5, you'll
Right.
find out that 10 is twice as many as 5, and then it goes to 2.
This is the n squared minus n formula.
Yeah. And so you actually see how this geometric sort of growth is smaller, if you want, slower than the exponential growth of relationships. And so you begin to really see what we were just reading a few minutes ago, how important the tensile relationship is between the vertices. And we tend to ignore that more often than we really recognize it as a tensile factor, not a vertex factor.
Have you mapped or compared the interrelationship idea of this n squared minus one of type tetrahedral thing to Fibonacci or to Fibonacci, for example?
No.
The Fibonacci sequence. You haven't mapped it? I'm going to do it. I'm excited.
Any sequence,
You got my brain going.
any sequence has to do repetition with
Right.
processes repeated. Without it, there's none. But I would like to come to what Richard was saying. Richard, if I just want you to tell me if I can put it this way. What you have done, you've done a system of 4 with one system, a system that is patriarchal system. Then you have processes that the legal code. Then you have authority in terms of fathers, emperors, whatever power. And then you have subjects.
Yeah, subjects.
That is the son, wives.
Right.
And yes, and you call it subjects. Is that those are the four apexes, the 4 vertices of your tetrahedral, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, it played it off of Fuller's idea of self and otherness. So
Okay, yes. Yeah.
So the tetrahedral model says that there's one vertex is the self, however that gets defined in terms of different layers, and then there's 3 othernesses. The validator othernesses, the personal otherness, and the resource otherness. And so that's why I was trying to put those basic factors that John described into that model. And then, of course, it grows because the person ends up being the fathers, the emperors, et cetera. So you can count all the different vertexes, and you'll see using that formula how many interrelationships there are in just a few things that John talked about.
Actually, I see it a little bit. I don't want to go too much detail into that, but this is the way I see it. One, you have patriarchal and legal, right?
Yeah, validators.
One
Yes.
and its own ordinance, like this.
Yes.
And then you have the subject that are processed through that is like this, is horizontal. And then you can put in a plane like that. You see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You have system and then processes, which are like how structured inside. What are the doors? How do the doors communicate within that system, the patriarchal system? And then you have now, you have the guards, which are people of authority, and say the workers that have to flow through that system according to the code, the traffic through the system. Yeah. I'm
So
true, Steve.
can I,
Joe, go ahead.
so the way I look at it is the system, then you have the domain, and then that's macro and micro, right? That's the way you're looking at this. And then the system is the validator or other, the person and the otherness, the personal otherness and the resource. And then underneath that is the domain specific, factors. And then
I think, yeah.
your
Yeah.
factor, then that's kind of like where the spiral kind of comes in to a certain degree.
Well, yeah, the other thing was interesting for me when I actually located the validators into that kind of model, then I realized that the validator vertex is also connected to the resource other and to the personal other. So whatever's
Right.
in that validator area, it acts as a governing system through the individual, if you want, and through the personal others and through the resource others. So if patriarchal value is the dominant value, it'll govern how the resources behave toward the individual. It'll govern how the individual allows himself to be subjected to a dominant sort of force, whether it's the father, mother, or father, husband, or the emperor. And so the system is going to be stabilized. You may not like it, but it will operate in a smooth and functional way if the governing system is the same for all of the other three. It's when you get the validators being in conflict or different. So you may have a person who has a validator that says, I have a right to my voice being heard. And if the emperor says, I'm sorry, you're a subject, you don't, then either you fall into compliance or you react. And as the China legal system was described, if you act out against the emperor, there's swift sort of treatment of you. In other words, you're executed probably. So that keeps the masses under control as well. So it's a fun kind of model to explore and see whether or not it really has merit in terms of using Bucky's thinking about self and otherness.
It is fun.
And if
It
I
is
may, go ahead, Joe, please go ahead.
It does have to do with topology and topological as well.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. One is top. You map it out first, and then the topological part is what we just to see the domain, and the system interact. If that makes sense.
And if I have it right, when you say self and others, you're having one self and three others. That makes the four vertices.
Right.
But then, because as I pointed out, every node or every vertices has exactly the same relationship with any other node. The definition of self could move to any node. And when you move the self from one node to another, then it shifts everything around. So that which was the self becomes the other, as the other, which is now the self, views its relationship to the other three. If that made any sense. Does that?
Well, yeah, it does. That's the other thing that I took out of Fuller when I first was reading about self and other. He also explained that self has its own otherness. In other words, how we raise a baby, his first contact with other is his extremities. So you teach the child to recognize the eye, the ear, the hands, the toes. And so you get the youngster starts to relate to his or her own otherness. And then eventually it also extends to other kinds of otherness, whether it's the mother or other members of the family or other members of the community. And so as it goes out into those othernesses, then I define them as personal others. In other words, things they're kind of intimate to you. And it doesn't have to be a person. It could be an object too. It's like somebody could be, their personal other may be the addiction that they have to a drug or an alcohol or whatever it might be, workaholic, etc. That becomes their personal other. In the same way, some people treat a religion as a resource other, something that they go to whenever they might need it, but not all the time. And others treat it as a personal other. It becomes an intimate part of their life. And so you can see institutions like, I'm going to use the church now in my example, of how they move from being just a resource to you and your community to becoming a personal resource that has a lot, you go back to what we started out talking about today. You ask what your feeling is about the church as a personal resource versus a church being just out there when you need it for births and marriages and deaths. the feeling tone will be quite different, I suspect.
I'd love to do that. I didn't realize where our clock went. I'd love to do this. Maybe we can do more. Because I have a personal experience of otherness with my own hands. In a hypnosis thing. I went back and I discovered my hand was me, and that was amazing. So I'd love to talk more about that. Anyway, so what a night we've had tonight, John. How are you feeling, and what's your takeaway tonight?
Been great. From China in 1433 to
Jeez,
the
just
current
sucking
state
my
of the
thumb.
world.
Right.
A few detours I hadn't expected, but I think they were great detours. So I'm got a lot going on in the head, thinking about history not repeating itself. How do we make sure history doesn't repeat itself? Anyway, so I'm happy I've been able to be part of this. I will be away for the next 2 weeks, so continue to have fun in my absence. And Susan, so how do you feel, and what do you take out of today?
I've enjoyed the ranging of topics getting interwoven for sure. What I take away is something that I get to share tonight. Earlier today, I was visiting with a patient, and he said he was developing a lab, a gentleman in his 70s, and I said, so can you tell me what you're doing in this chemical lab, or would you have to annihilate me if you shared? And he said with a group of friends that they've been going to church together since they were youngsters. Some are chemistry guys, mathematicians, all kinds of things. He's actually a builder. And what they're working on right now is a project that would take the emissions from the smokestacks and run it into algae. And he's said, you know what, we're in Arizona because Arizona State University is very interested in this kind of stuff and supportive. He says, we've had government come in, and I told him about our Bucky call. And it was just so wonderful to see somebody taking that bigger view of saying, instead of that leftover thing being pollution with that human, that limited Malthusian perspective, to say, gosh, that leftover is really the profit, that is the seed that's going to start the next cycle of regeneration. And we had a number of ideas of what the algae could be doing as it used the carbon. And it was just kind of fun to see Bucky out living in the world.
Cool.
And Manu, how do you feel, and what are you taking away?
I've got contagion from your smile. That's the way I feel now. It's really contagious. But I'm grateful to be here this morning. And with all the participation, thank you all for giving the best you could this morning. What I take away are simple. One, I put in the learning from histories. There's no one history, there are many strengths, learning from histories. But second, trying to understand general principles. And third, applying them to create our future, because our future doesn't exist yet. We've got to create it, or it's going to be created for us by somebody else. So that's what I take away from here. Otherwise, I thank you all. Joe, how do you feel? What do you take away? Or are you being? I'm very fuzzy this morning.
I have not gone now.
Okay.
No. I'm a little bit scattered. I'm a little tired, but I'm very grateful for this evening, and appreciate going through the book, having some discussion about the political systems themselves, their weaknesses, and just the discussion on Malthusian economics and the things that Richard had put, or that John had put in the chat. and then mapping them to Richard's model. And I actually am just drawing some things out now, and just thinking about how other problems can apply to this model, specifically along the lines of how you would measure interconnectedness, stability, and flexibility, and specialization within that model. There's the top, and I clearly saw the topological and the topographical aspects of it much more clearly now. And I see the factors that Richard's applying clearly as well. So I'll be interested to see if Steve can map the Fibonacci sequence to it. Be cool. But these are the types of models where we were playing around with the other day with Manu, some of the equations that you were sharing with us. They really started to have context. And that's a lot of fun when you start to see the connections between the equations, the models that we're talking about, the tetrahedron, and reality. So I had a good time today. I had a really good time. Yeah, I think, you know, again, I'm going to play around with your model a little bit, Richard, and apply it to much more simplistic problems. Nothing too challenging. Just to get a feel for it. So I'm looking forward to doing that. So with that, who's left? Is Richard, are you?
No, Richard and Edward, who's gone.
No. So I can't ask somebody that's not here, right? That would be very challenging. So I'm gonna go with you, Richard. Richard, how do you? Yeah.
Well, I really feel good about being reconnected and earlier being reconnected to Steve and having the connection surface the way it has tonight. But what really is interesting for me is to start out with a very tuned in focus on a particular chapter or pages, and then to watch or experience the free flow that came out of that. And you say the interweaving between history and current, and it felt so freeing, even though the flow of ideas and thinking was quite diverse. So yeah, it was that was a big takeaway for me to be able to see the real benefit of free flow of ideas, even though we started out on a tuned in look at a particular sort of chapter and pages. So thank you all. This has been an enjoyable Saturday evening here in Calgary.
Well, so call on me then, Richard, if you would. I'm the last guy here.
Yes. Steve, how are you feeling and what did you take away?
I'm just so honored to be with this group of people and this free flow of information. I mean, honestly, this is so much better than reading this book on my own. I could have finished these 8 pages or 5 pages, whatever he did, and I wouldn't have any of the awareness that I've had now. I'm grateful that, I don't know what you did, John, but you getting into that history of China and outlining all those things, that is profound. And I'm still very interested in, I don't know, maybe Joe, you can dream about it, but I'm wondering how 1650 Confucius really has affected this whole thing down to the 1433 outline of international travel, that the Chinese didn't want to, and I can understand that they don't want to dilute their culture. It's like non-dilution. So we're going to stay isolated and we're going to be pure and we're going to be the center of the world. I don't know. I'd like to continue to develop that. I hope we do. Manu's bringing up amplitude and going with frequency modulation, amplitude, going with what do you think and how do you feel? That was big time for me. It goes with left brain, right brain, you know, frequency, amplitude. Ooh, I just like that duality. and I loved that new epiphany that I had going for it. I love the idea of the smokestack going into the into the algae field. I love that. You know, and I think I've heard something on that on the news. My takeaway today is I've got to, when something stands out and say, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to quickly go to my thing here and I'm going to say this and this and this, and here's the source, because not remembering about the Darwin thing. I've heard this a couple of times about Darwin being misquoted and misstated. And just like Schrodinger, he came up with the cat in the box. I think that was Schrodinger's cat in the box, right? And yet he brought up that cat in the box story, showing how stupid his formula was, that there was a problem with his formula because it's a stupid cat in the box, and everybody took the cat in the box. They've been running with it and saying that's the way it is. Schrodinger didn't think so. Einstein didn't think so. And everybody else grabbed on it. Copenhagen interpretation, 23% of physicists held onto that like a Bible, and the rest of the guys are thinking all freely, and the culture's stymied by this dogma. Whew. Okay, that was my rant. We've gone 1 minute over. 1 minute behind the point. I love you guys. This is so wonderful. Come back again. John, we're going to miss you, dadgummit.
Okay. I'll be back.
See y'all.
Where's John going to?
I will be down south this coming week and then traveling back on Sunday, and then I got on a plane to go to Sydney. So the following Sunday, I'll be traveling back from Sydney to Perth.
Are you going to drive or are you going to fly?
Driving within Western Australia, flying across Australia.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, we're available in flight if you want.
Yeah.
It's a big country for those who don't know.
Yeah.
It's still as big.
It is. Okay.
Yeah,
Bye
see you.
all.
Bye-bye all.